This is the brand new Sony A7V, their do-it-all prosumer camera, but today we're going to be comparing it to the A7RV, their high-resolution photography powerhouse, as well as the A9III, which is their super high-tech sports action fast speed camera. And I think it actually pulls a lot from each of these cameras, as well as the Alpha One Mark II. But for you as a photographer, which one is going to be best for your specific use case? Let's talk about it. Now, I've worked with Sony in the past on different projects and things, but they have zero clue I'm making this video. All of these things are things that I own myself, so I'm trying to come to it with as unbiased of an opinion as possible. It's not really supposed to be a review anyway. It's more of an overview and an idea of trying to make sure that I'm kind of helping you, the viewer and photographer, kind of line up with the camera that best suits your needs and workflow. So there are going to be two small caveats here. The first of which being that I no longer own an A7 IV. I did own that camera for a while. It was the first camera that I bought when I switched over to the Sony system. Shot thousands of images, lots of projects, and actually really enjoyed that camera. But I do not have one in my hands right now to compare to this stuff. Right off the bat, if you are trying to figure out if you are going to buy a used A7 IV or upgrade to the A7V, here's just like a quick overview of what I would say in that use case. The first thing being, it depends on how many lenses and how much money you have to spend, how invested you are in the ecosystem already. So if you are trying to battle out, do I buy another camera and another lens? Like, maybe the A7 IV would be good for you because frankly, as a photographer, the A7 IV is a great camera. One of the things I will say though is the A7V has fixed one of the main issues that I see a lot of my friends dealing with, which is the fact that the shutter in the A7 IV is only rated to about 200,000 clicks, and the A7V has a lot of the body components from the A7RV, meaning that this shutter is rated to 500,000 shutter clicks. So it's one of those things that you're future-proofing, adding a little bit more insurance in a way to your stuff, just so you're much less likely to be at a gig and have your shutter break on an A7V than an A7 IV. The other thing being, while the A7 IV is really great, especially for stuff like this, if you're doing like talking head stuff, the A7 IV can be a really good camera. But if you are going to do video with it, I would definitely suggest the A7V. The A7V is not going to overheat nearly as much as the A7 IV does. The A7V, again, borrows things from the A7RV, and so it doesn't have that same issue that the A7 IV has. And then the last thing would be that if you are looking to do more things with a electronic shutter, if there's just more instances where you need an electronic shutter for something, the A7 IV and the A7RV both have really slow sensor readouts. So you'll get this like really weird warping effect if you have any movement and you're using electronic shutter. The A7V has a much faster sensor readout, and so you're not going to be running into that nearly as much. So if that's something that you also prioritize, I would definitely go with the A7V. And then lastly, I remember when I first reviewed the A7RV and we first got this multi-axis, 4-axis tilt screen, I remember saying that just that alone, I would pay like $500 extra for. It is definitely worth it for me to have that screen. It was one of the things that annoyed me when I was shooting with the A7RV and the A7 IV side to side, was just the rear screen here being significantly better on the A7RV. The A7V has that same thing. The A7 IV does not. Yes, I'm going to be saying A7 IV, A7R5, A7V. It is a lot to try to think of all these different models, which is why I'm making this video. One of the things I will say that is something that did not get upgraded on the A7V, and it is probably the only actual disappointment, but it's the one thing that keeps this feeling like a prosumer camera, is the viewfinder. I've been doing photography professionally for almost 20 years, and I'm just like an old school person. I started with viewfinders, and most of my workflow as I'm photographing things is still pulling a screen up or pulling the camera up to my eye, looking through an EVF. When I do that on this camera, the A7V, the viewfinder is fine, but it is noticeable if you're going from an A7R5 that has such a bigger display, and then you come up and you're just going back and forth. This one is just significantly smaller. It is like the one thing that's not like a professional level. Everything else is pro level. The only thing that's not pro level is the EVF. I know why they did it, because the A7 series, it's meant to be their basic series, but it's the thing that they shove almost everything else into that's not like their pro level cameras technically. It's not a thing that's going to impact your work at all. It's just an experience thing. Now, one of the things that was really impressive actually, and one of the reasons why I actually started shooting a lot more on Sony cameras than when I was using my Leica M10s, was that the dynamic range was just a lot better. If you look at like the people that actually deep dive into the actual like test charts and things of measuring the legitimate dynamic range out of this, the A7V has the dynamic range. It matches the same dynamic range that I have on my Hasselblad X2D2. Like, it has medium format levels of dynamic range. The A7R5 has never been a camera I've had an issue with dynamic range with, ever. And it has like about a stop better at its maximum than even the A7R5 does. And is it super, super noticeable? No, like not in practice unless you were in like just a really, really super high dynamic range setting. And as I did some tests with this little test chart here between these three cameras, and a comment that I actually had specifically was someone that was asking if I could compare the medium raw files on the A7R5 to the A7V, and specifically in dynamic range. That actually was the worst performer out of all of them. So once I was getting to 4 stops overexposed, that's when I really started to see like a lot of image degradation, which I've used the A7R5 in its medium raw mode because it has a mode where you can do this at 26 megapixels, and the APS-C crop mode is also 26 megapixels. But what's cool is like the A7V here borrows almost everything in the body of the A7R5, minus 2 things that I'm like keenly aware of outside of obviously the sensor. I guess as well, the A7V has a different processor than the A7R5, but everything from the A7R5 forward all have some sort of like the AI chip, which provides just significantly better focusing and gives you better like auto white balance and all sorts of other things that just have modernized these cameras. The first of which we've obviously talked about being the EVF. The other thing we talked about was that it has the same shutter mechanism. Also, it has the internals for heating and heat dissipation. But one of the things that is different is the card slots here. It's another just like slight delineation. So the A7R5, A9III, and the Alpha 1 Mark II, they all have the dual CF Express Type A ports and SD card ports. The A7V has dual ports, so it's still like a prosumer level camera, but it only allows you to use a CF Express Type A card in the first slot, and then you have to use an SD card in the second slot. Probably not that big a deal to a lot of people, but if you are someone that matters to, I think most people out there doing photography work, a lot of us are still using SD cards, so it's not that big a deal. Now, the thing about the A9III that is really unique is that its sensor is a global shutter sensor, meaning that it reads out all at once. It's a very different thing. I don't think it's something that I even really realized much until the last probably 5 or 6 years or so, was just how a sensor doesn't read out immediately every single pixel. It goes from top to bottom, slowly reading out every single thing, some faster than others. This camera is the first commercially available one for photography that does full sensor readout instantaneously. The problem is if you are using just the electronic shutter and not the mechanical shutter, you end up getting a lot of warping as the sensor is reading from top to bottom. The A7R5 is terrible at this. I never shoot this camera in electronic shutter mode because I'm worried about getting that warping. The A7 IV also did not have good rolling shutter performance. It was really slow, but the A7V has much, much better rolling shutter performance in electronic shutter mode. One of the things that I think I said, because I thought it was communicated to me, was that there was going to be no image drop off between mechanical and electronic shutter mode. And it seems like in some of the testing that people have done, there is a little bit of dynamic range hit, not a ton. I still am going to recommend people use this in mechanical shutter unless you need it. I also have just set up this camera so that the C3 button is electronic shutter switch. So if I need to like all of a sudden get really quiet at a wedding or something, I can just click this button, then I'm instantly in a silent shutter mode. But it's the first camera outside of like the A1 series or the A9 series that gives you fast enough performance that you could, if you really wanted to, just go all day on electronic shutter mode for the most part, up until you needed to use some flashes or strobes and be good to go on this. The readout in low light and with cheap LEDs and stuff can be an issue kind of no matter what is happening. I will say that the A7V, most of the Sony cameras have an anti-flicker mode. That anti-flicker mode does not work in electronic shutter mode though, which is interesting. It's one of those things where if you are having an issue with matching the rate of some cheap LEDs in a venue, or it might be a trade-off to switch back to mechanical shutter mode. You might have to just have that sound. Personally, I would much rather have images that worked and make a little bit of noise than not. It is much more usable and is going to work in many more situations than almost any other Sony camera out there or any other camera out there in general because the sensor readout is so fast. Now, one of the other things about the A9III that is pretty amazing is it'll do up to 120 photos per second. The A7V does not do 120, it doesn't do 60, but it will do 30 in a quick burst. You can assign a button to switch over and do 30 frames a second for about 1 second. Back when I was doing NFL photography, if I had this camera, my photos would be significantly better than the 5D series that I was using at the time. I would have such cool photos. Also, it has pre-capture, so if that's something you're interested in, I've never used that feature, but I can see where sports or wildlife, that kind of stuff would be really useful. But I'll also add that the autofocus in all of these cameras is incredible. Every single camera that Sony has put out since the A7R V, all of them have very good autofocus. The best autofocus I've used in any camera. It's really, really sticky. It tracks my subjects exactly how I want them to. And there are settings in the menu that you can decide on how sticky you want the autofocus to be to a person. Now, I'm not going to get into video a ton here, but there's a lot of us doing some hybrid stuff lately. And I will say that the A7V is a really good hybrid camera. It'll do 4K 60. So if you want some slow motion stuff, like I could easily go and video an entire wedding on the A7V and come away with like a really, really good wedding film. It's a great camera. There's a lot of people that have been complaining it doesn't have open gates, but it's just something that Sony doesn't have right now anyway. And if I was going to do any combination of mostly photo and video, I would absolutely get an A7V, unless you really want to spend the money on an A9III or an Alpha 1 Mark II. For most people, this is going to do every bit of what they need in both photo and video. That said, if you are wanting more resolution, more flexibility, and just like a solid photo camera, I do think this camera gives me a lot of flexibility and is just a fantastic camera. And if I had like, say, like two A7R5s, I wouldn't sell them to go to an A7V necessarily, unless I was going to do more hybrid photo video coverage. But it all depends on your use case, and I'm just trying to point out all the different options and reasons why someone might take something over the other one. Personally, I still think that if I'm recommending a pure photography camera to a lot of people, I would probably do the A7R5, but the A7V, again, is incredible. It's kind of like one of those, like, you're gonna be great either way, and I don't think either person, even if they made the wrong decision, they're not making the wrong decision, if that makes sense. So ultimately, all these cameras are fantastic. I think that the A7V is a really obvious choice for almost anybody out there. Sports photographers are going to love this camera. I think wildlife photographers are still going to love this camera. I think that landscape photographers are going to love this camera. I think wedding photographers, this is kind of like the camera to get if you don't want to go in a little more of a niche like setup with like an A7R5 or an A9III or an A1II. You know, like, it's just the camera that most people should buy. The vast majority of people, if they're going like, hey, I want a Sony camera, I do XYZ thing, like, this is made to be the camera for the vast majority of people. It does almost everything really, really well. It doesn't niche into every single little corner as much as the more dedicated cameras, but 33 megapixels, really good IBIS, really good video, really great dynamic range, actually incredible dynamic range, which is for me one of the most important things in a camera, and still shocking, to be honest, that it has better dynamic range than the A7R5. The best autofocus I've ever used. Again, the only knock I really even have on this is the EVF, but it's one of those things, again, that if you don't have a different camera that has a bigger, better EVF and you have the consistency of like having two of these, I don't see any issue with that at all. So let me know what you think about all this in the comments down below. I know this video is a little more rambly, a little bit more kind of all over the place, but there's just so much information to go into about all the different options. And hopefully this was a little bit more clarifying to you. These are all great options, but I do think that the vast majority of people are going to be served really, really well with the A7V. So if you want to watch my initial video on the A7V, you can do it up here. Watch my video comparing the A9III and the A7R V up here, and I will see you in one of those.